Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first talk in our spring semester's research seminar. This is the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the research seminar is organized jointly with CELFIS, that's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and ICUB, that's the research institute at the same university. We're grateful and happy to be able to record the project via which this seminar series is funded. And that project is sponsored by Wittgenstein, that's the local public funding agency for research. And its code is PN-3-Roman-P1-1-PD-2019-0535. And we're very grateful to our public sponsor, as we are grateful to our current speaker. Professor Sorin Bangu from the University of Bergen, Norway, is a fantastic researcher and a dear friend. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome him again to our research seminar. Tonight, Sorin will be speaking to us about an analogous investigation, later Wittgenstein, on psychological and mathematical discourse. Sorin, please take it away.
Good. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Andrei. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Thanks to all of you for attending. It's a great pleasure to speak in the seminar. So, as you can see, that is my title. But after sending it, I realized that the original title is a bit too broad. So I should begin by telling you that I'm not going to cover the whole of mathematics, but I'll focus on arithmetic. Even on very basic arithmetic. So sentences like 2 + 2 = 4. That's what you're going to hear about tonight. By later Wittgenstein, I mean the Wittgenstein we find, so that the main topic of the talk today is going to be work by later Wittgenstein. And by later Wittgenstein, I mean the Wittgenstein we find in the 3 works on the slide. So I'll look at his philosophical investigations, and I refer to this as PI, as usual. But I'll mostly draw on his 2 works dealing specifically with mathematics in his later period. So first is the Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics. That is a book that was described as you can see on the slide, cryptic, fragmentary, and unfinished in one of its first reviews. Now, worse things have been said about it, but I'm not going to repeat them here. I don't think they are true, by the way. But this characterization by Alan Ross Anderson, the famous logician, seems to me quite accurate, actually. So I call this a book, although Wittgenstein never approved of what was collected in it. However, part 1 of RFM has an intimate connection to PI, since Wittgenstein intended to include it in PI. And most of part 1 of PI was approved by Wittgenstein. I also rely on his lectures on the foundations of mathematics, the green book on the slide. That's a series of lectures he delivered in English in 1939 in Cambridge. Was edited by Cora Diamond in, I think, 1976. The source in the background of all of this is Wittgenstein's Nachlass, from which the 2 works were compiled. That's a source maintained by my colleagues here at the archives in Bergen. And I'm bringing this up since at some point I'll need to refer to material that is not translated and that is not included in RFM or LFM or LFM. Now, that's the plan for what follows. I have basically one goal today. I'll explain how I think that this remark should be understood. Right? So the remark you see on the slide, an investigation is possible in connection with mathematics, which is entirely analogous to our investigation of psychology. So that is from PI, appears in what is now known as part 2, this remark 14, I think the last one in the book. And unfortunately, there is not that much in the secondary literature on it. So trying to explain it, trying to understand what he had in mind might be a useful exercise. So the second point I'll make is to sketch how one can use this remark in order to explain the central, what I take to be the central goal or the central claim in philosophical investigations, which is in remark 133, namely, it's a very ambitious and radical goal, namely that the philosophical problem should completely disappear. I should say that I think it's natural to take this claim to cover philosophical problems about mathematics too. So they are going to disappear too. Although Wittgenstein, as many of you know, doesn't talk about these problems in the PI, doesn't talk about them at all, in fact. All right, so the first thing to say by way of clarifying this remark is that by investigation here, Wittgenstein means a grammatical investigation. And as he puts it in PI 90, such an investigation is meant to shed light on a problem, on a philosophical problem. And this kind of investigation, we are told, clears misunderstanding away. What kind of misunderstandings? Well, those caused, among other things, by certain analogies between the forms of expression in different regions of language. And these confusions generate philosophical problems for Wittgenstein. In PI, he conducts this kind of investigation on psychological sentences, and we'll go through this in a moment. When it comes to mathematical sentences, PI, as I said, is virtually of no help. So what I will do is try to extract or reconstruct this kind of investigation from the remarks, the RFM, and from the lectures, the LFM, and see where it leads us. So a grammatical investigation, what is it? It consists in presenting an inventory or a survey of the functions of the roles or uses of words or sentences. So the result of such an investigation, what Wittgenstein calls a description of these functions and roles that certain linguistic items perform, either words or sentences. We're going to focus on sentences today, first on psychological sentences, then on certain kind of mathematical sentences, simple basic calculations, as I said. So when it comes to this type of investigation, the method is simply to look and see, since we cannot guess how those sentences work. So in a very broad sense, one may say that it is even an empirical type of investigation. And I regard this as a strong naturalist component of Wittgenstein's methodology. Okay, so we have to look and see, and what we're going to see is, according to Wittgenstein, that such functions and roles are almost never unique. So sentences do not play unique roles in language. They don't have unique functions, but have a variety of uses in language. And as we'll see in a moment, this holds for psychological sentences and also for mathematical sentences. So you see a reference to the Tractatus here. And I have it since this emphasis on the variety of roles is exactly what marks the main difference, to my mind, the main difference between the ways he understood the role of language in his earlier philosophy and his later one. If you recall, when he was talking about this earlier phase in the preface of the PI, he mentioned some grave mistakes, quote unquote. And I think that missing this diversity was perhaps the most serious of them. So let's see how this grammatical investigation works for psychological sentences first, and then we'll move on to a kind of parallel investigation of mathematical sentences. So consider a typical psychological sentence: I have a pain, or I am in pain. The starting point is always to ask, what are the functions of such a sentence? What are its roles? What are the uses of such a sentence? What do we do with it? So Wittgenstein would advise here to try to get a clear view of on the regions of language to which such a sentence belongs. So that would be the goal. And as far as I can tell, there are three such regions or three such uses that are highlighted in PI. So first of all, such a sentence may have an assertoric role. It can be used to express a proposition and make a statement. That's a true or false statement. So if I say now that I have a pain or that I'm in pain, I'll be saying something false, fortunately. I'll be making a false assertion. But in addition to this assertoric role, someone might think that they can use the sentence in a referential or representational way, as having a descriptive role. By analogy with another sentence that has a somewhat similar superficial grammatical form, I have a coin in my pocket, for instance. So I describe to you what I have in my pocket. Finally, the third use is the expressive use. And now in this capacity, the sentence is used simply to replace a cry of pain. So the sentence would have the role of a more civilized way of expressing or manifesting someone's pain. It would stand in for something like an exclamation, a cry of pain. So these are the three candidate functions we can easily identify for such a sentence. But things get more complicated because once we put more thought into this, we'll realize that the second function is actually very problematic. The second function, that is the referential representation or descriptive function. Now, on this slide, which builds on the previous one, I mean to capture Wittgenstein's view on these functions. So in a sense, it's a summary of his philosophy of mind, like a ridiculously short summary. In brief, he accepts that the sentence has the first and the third function, and argues that it does not have the second representational role. So that is the analogy that suggested this function is deceptive. So his key point, I take it, is that when we look at these functions, the primary function, or the function that the sentence has in the primitive language games, or the typical function, is the expressive one. But if this is its primary function, to be an avowal, then the sentence, when used like this, does not have a truth value. And this is crucial to realize. So the sentence, I am in pain, or I have a pain, does not have a truth value. One is used as a avowal. I repeat it just because it's so important. What follows is perhaps even more important. Namely that there is no point, or it's simply meaningless to think in terms of knowledge here, right? So this is why he says that I know I'm in pain is nonsense. And this is so because knowledge, as we know, is factive. To know P entails that P is true. And when P stands for I'm in pain, so this is not truth at all. So as long as such a sentence in this use does not have any truth value, then knowledge is out of the question. Now, things are even more complicated in PI because the book, in addition to this point, contains a difficult argument to the effect that the sentence does not have a representational role either. That we do not use it to refer to private objects. Now, I cannot go over this argument here. It's too complicated, and it's not on my agenda today. But just to summarize, those 2 points taken together, the lack of truth value and the rejection of the idea of a private object, so those together lead to the conclusion that some central problems in philosophy of mind, very much discussed today and they've been discussed during his time as well. So those central problems are pseudo-problems. And I mean the zombie issue, the qualia, the knowledge of other minds, and so on. So they disappear because they are all variation on just one ill-posed question. And I'm going to formulate this question, is on the slide. The question is like this: can I know that you have what I know I have, right? But as long as knowledge and absolute privacy are not issues here, it turns out that this question does not actually ask anything. Now, obviously, I'm going very fast over these issues here. There is way more to say about how the argument works, but that will be a task for another day, and maybe also for another person, because my main interest is not psychological sentences. They've been discussed a lot in secondary literature, but mathematical sentences, well, they were not explored in such detail. So finally, another point that's important to bear in mind is that on my reading, this third expressive function, which I said is the primary one, is introduced by Wittgenstein in a kind of a low-key, very modest way. He says about it that it's just a possibility. So it is only a possibility that this sentence is used in this expressive way. And what he means by this is that he's not going to present a proof that this is indeed the primary function, or a theory, or anything like that. So it simply comes to us to get ourselves to look at the sentence in this way, despite the fact that, as you probably remember, as he says in PI 109, we have an urge to misunderstand the grammar. So the urge is to take the sentence as having a unique role and conflate the three roles, and thus to accept the referential role as a package with the other roles. But if we resist this urge, then there are philosophical benefits. And I will emphasize those philosophical benefits when it comes to mathematics. So let's move on to mathematics. So as I said, I will be mostly focused on very simple sentences, basic calculations, such as 2 times 2 is 4. And the idea is to look at the uses of such sentences and to get clear to which regions of language they belong. So I'll do pretty much the same thing we have done for psychological sentence and try to offer an inventory of these functions, a übersichtliche Darstellung, right? So that's what the term that became famous from philosophical investigations. So if one tries to identify these functions, the first role for such a sentence is clearly that of expressing a proposition, of making an assertion, a true statement. So naturally, 2 times 2 equals 4 is a true proposition. That's not in doubt. But when it comes to this function, Wittgenstein has something very interesting to say. And that is in the remark in yellow on the slide. He says, we are using to saying 2 times 2 is 4, and the verb is makes this into a proposition and apparently establishes a close kinship with everything that we call a proposition, whereas it is a matter only of a very superficial relationship. So keeping in mind and bracketing all the complications raised by the translation of Satz, Satz can mean sentence and proposition, and that's the German word. The way I will read this is that 2 times 2 equals 4 and other mathematical sentences do function as declarative truth-ab sentences, as propositions or statements. It does not deny this. But he says that this role is not their primary role, that he says that this role is rather superficial. So we'll have to understand what superficial means here, and we'll return to this later. So now the next question to ask is whether such a sentence has other functions, especially a primary function, a function which is not superficial. Well, another function or role of such a sentence is representational or referential, you might think. So the function of such a sentence would be to represent some kind of facts, and as a representation, it would be a representation of some sort of reality. And we can recognize here the Platonist idea, Wittgenstein will say the Platonist temptation. This discussion appears in the lectures on the foundations of mathematics and LFM, where he says this. I have it on the slide. You might say, can't we explain what we mean by is true? For example, to say that P is true means that it corresponds with reality or that it is in accordance with reality. So P here stands obviously for a mathematical sentence. That's the context. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that Wittgenstein is not going to be happy with this idea. And he offers a series of very clever and subtle arguments against Platonism. And we'll discuss the main one in a moment. But in LFM, he insists on the fact that Platonism only seems to be offering an explanation while not delivering on the promise. And what he says more precisely is that to give this explanation in terms of correspondence with a reality, it would come to saying nothing at all. So all those are quotes from LFM. It would come to saying nothing at all, a mere truism, if we leave out the question of how it corresponds, in what sense it corresponds. So this is an objection which I read as a kind of a burden of proof type of objection. It is the Platonist obligation to clarify this correspondence relation. Otherwise, we simply trade one mystery for another. And this kind of objection, by the way, so for those of you who are familiar with theories, contemporary theories of truth, this kind of objection has become somewhat of a standard objection against all correspondence theories. That until we are told how this correspondence is supposed to work, what correspondence is, we don't really have a genuine answer here, but merely a new word. So that means that we can put the representation function aside and move on to the third function of such a sentence, or the third type of use it might have, which is normative. And that's another possibility that Wittgenstein thinks of, namely that this sentence expresses norms or rules. So they're what we may call prescriptive sentences, normative sentences. They specify what is right, what is correct to say, what one should say, what one must say. And indeed, we use such sentences, sentences that look declarative, indicative to express norms or rules, right? We say, for instance, that I don't know, a football team has 11 players, well, at least at the beginning of the game, and things like that. So we express a norm in an indicative form, a form of indicative sentence. Now, for Wittgenstein, this is going to be the primary function, the one that is not superficial, we can presume. So this idea, to my mind, is truly bold, even revolutionary. And to convince you that he did hold such an unusually original view, here is some textual evidence. There is such evidence both in RFM and in LFM, as we will see. But one remark, which is my favorite in some regards, so this, in which this idea comes out extremely clearly, has not been translated, unfortunately, and included in these works. It's in an atlas and says the following. One can say of the sentence of mathematics that they are normative sentences, and this characterizes their use. The italics is Wittgenstein himself. This is manuscripts 123, line 49. I got help with this, with a translation from my colleague Alois Pickler and also from Mihai Bauer. Also, here is more textual evidence. What I'm saying comes to this: that mathematics is normative. Can you imagine all mathematical sentences or propositions? Is the same Satz word that appears again and again. Can you imagine all mathematical proposition expressed in the imperative? For example, let 10 times 10 be 100. And the context is that the answer is yes. In RFM part 7, remark 6, he says, there is no doubt at all that in certain language games, mathematical propositions play the part of rules of description as opposed to descriptive propositions. We also have this other point he makes, that I proceed from certain rules and I get a new rule that 136 times 51 equals 6,936. I hope that's correct. I didn't check. And finally, this one, mathematical propositions are rules of grammar. Mathematical propositions are rules of expression, paradigms, propositions dependent on experience, but made independent of. So here suggests the empirical origin of these rules, an idea that's very important, but we don't have time to discuss today. So here is a summary of where we are right now. I have identified 3 possible rules for an arithmetical sentence, and those are to function as an assertion, as a representation, and as a rule. And we have seen a reason why the sentence does not play a representational role, or at least some sketch of the argument. And this inventory or survey also explicates a paragraph at the beginning of the lectures on the foundations of mathematics, where he presents his project in philosophy of mathematics. And I put this in yellow on the slides. The misunderstandings, he says he wants to target, are those created by not having a clear image of these different functions of a mathematical sentence. So at this point, we can take stock. We're pretty much almost past the middle of the talk. We can take stock and present how the analogy is supposed to work. So the grammatical investigation of psychology on the left delivers the survey. You can see on the left side, and we have a similar inventory for mathematics on the right side. Also, what I've done was to sketch Wittgenstein's argument to the effect that some central problems in philosophy of mind disappear as a result of taking on board this expressivist proposal. So the work that remains to be done in the next something like 7 slides is to see how this leads to what the stuff on the right side leads to the dissolution of some important problems in the philosophy of mathematics. And the problem to deal with is what accounts for the necessity or the irrefutability of mathematical propositions or statements. How this problem disappears because, so to show how this problem disappears, because such sentences are actually not propositions to begin with. So all the worries that the Platonists and conventionalists aim to address are actually immaterial. Therefore, such doctrines are not needed. So they're not wrong, but pointless. They don't address a real problem. There's no problem to solve for them. Well, let's see how this works quickly. So as we saw, for Wittgenstein, mathematical sentences functions primarily as rules. And as I hinted at before, we hopefully begin to understand why those sentences are unfalsifiable. They are not so as true propositions, they are unfalsifiable as rules, because rules can be falsified. And that's a grammatical point, right? Doesn't make sense to say of a rule that is false. Doesn't make sense to say it's true either, right? A rule does not have a truth value. And the relevant contrast for him is not between, I insist on this, is not between contingent versus necessary propositions, but between propositions on one hand and rules on the other hand. And these are the different functions that the sentence may have. So even when functioning as rules, mathematical sentences appear disguised as assertions or propositions. They have the same something is something form, like 2 times 2 is 4. They continue to have this form, while they should be understood more as imperatives or prescriptions. So this is, by the way, a view that is rather hard to extract from Wittgenstein's writings. And I have to say, without hoping not to get into any gratuitous polemics or anything, that the secondary literature is not terribly helpful to explain this point. Even very competent Wittgenstein scholars have troubles to express it properly. So here is one way to present Wittgenstein's views. So we are told, for instance, that, quote, Wittgenstein denies that necessary propositions are truths in the first place. Well, I find this quite confusing, because if you think of our sentence 2 times 2 equals 4, then you may conclude that Wittgenstein denies that this is true. That's very problematic. First of all, this is not how we think of it. That's not a natural way to think of it. It's quite natural to say that it is true that 2 times 2 equals 4. And second, Wittgenstein himself talks about mathematical truth quite liberally in everywhere you look, in many places, as you can see on the slide. So what is going on? Well, I offer what I take to be a more precise formulation of his position. Right? So Wittgenstein accepts that the mathematical sentence on the bottom of the slide, Wittgenstein accepts that the mathematical sentence is or can function as a true proposition, but denies that it is irrefutable as a proposition. It is irrefutable as a rule. So let's go more deeply into this. So let's move on to the benefits of this account. That's the philosophical payoff that it gives, so to speak. So first of all, let me formulate the problem of necessity in philosophy of mathematics as I think Wittgenstein understood it. Traditionally, we think of mathematical sentences expressing propositions or statements which are somehow special or different from other true propositions. For instance, grass is green, right? 2 times 2 equals 4 is unfalsifiable and necessary, while grass is green is falsifiable or contingent. So the problem seems to be to explain the difference or to specify what makes the first proposition unfalsifiable. So importantly, this is an explanatory question. That's very that's crucial to understand. Now, one traditional answer is given by Platonism, which says in essence that the proposition 2 times 2 equals 4 is true of a mind-independent, acausal, immutable reality. We all know the picture, the Platonist picture. And such a sentence, such a proposition cannot be false because what it is true of, this reality it describes, or it corresponds to, is ideal, crystalline, immutable, perfect, so forth and so on. So for the Platonist, there are propositions which are merely true, contingent, refutable, like grass is green, but 2 times 2 equals 4 is not like them. It is irrefutable. So irrefutability would be an additional property of this proposition to be accounted for, a property which grass is green does not have. Now, where does Wittgenstein stand on this? Well, for him, the Platonist already made a mistake, since it aims to offer an explanation of the irrefutability of 2 times 2 equals 4 as a proposition, like regarding it as a proposition. While in fact 2 times 2 equals 4 is unfalsifiable in virtue of functioning as a rule. Hence, no such additional property exists is not necessary. Right? So such an additional property to be explained because rules just are unfalsifiable, and that's a grammatical point we come back to again and again. So there's basically nothing to explain. The Platonist assumption does not hold. The Platonist faces a pseudo problem. The Platonist explanation is simply not needed. It's pointless. Right? It's not that it's wrong, but it's simply pointless. Addresses a problem that doesn't exist really. So I was thinking how to capture this in more like sort of colloquial terms, and here is a situation that I think partially illustrates the form of the argument, the type of the pseudo problem we are dealing with here. So suppose you meet someone, let's call him Joey, who doesn't pay much attention to what's going on around him, and Joey has heard of a famous guy named Einstein, and also came across a photograph showing Einstein playing the violin. That's the famous picture of, maybe you've seen it before. Now, Joey asks you to explain to him why was Einstein famous, and now it turns out what he has in mind, what he means is that famous as a violinist. Looking at this picture, and now the normal reaction here is going to be that there is basically nothing to explain really. Or as Wittgenstein put it at some point in PI, the question contains a mistake. And what's the mistake? Well, the question obviously makes a wrong assumption, right? Namely that Einstein was famous as a violinist. And this is what happens now. If you think in the point of this analogy, this is what happens with Platonism as well. It attempts to explain the irrefutability of 2 times 2 equals 4 under the assumption that it is an irrefutable proposition, under the assumption that it's a proposition in the first place. While for Wittgenstein, it is a rule, and therefore irrefutable, since rules are irrefutable. So 2 times 2 equals 4 is not a special kind of proposition, simply because it's not a proposition at all. Is not used as a proposition at all. Now, bearing this in mind, we can see that Wittgenstein, what Wittgenstein has to say to the conventionalists. So this is another ism that Wittgenstein aims to, in a way, put out of business. For them, a mathematical proposition is unfalsifiable or necessarily true because it is analytic, you know, the story, and it is so because of the definitional conventions we made about its constituent terms. So if you follow Ayer and Carnap and Putnam, as you have it on the slide, conventionalism explains mathematical necessity of a proposition in terms of a convention. As Ayer put it famously, the principles of logic and mathematics are true universally simply because we never allow them to be anything else. Then we see that why Putnam says that Carnap's conventionalism was an explanation of the origin of logical necessity in human stipulation. Now, pretty much like the Platonists, for Wittgenstein, the conventionalists too begin with a mistake. And it is the same as the Platonist error, since the conventionalists too set out to offer an explanation of the irrefutability of 2 times 2 equals 4 as a proposition, while 2 times 2 equals 4 is unfalsifiable in virtue of functioning as a rule or as a convention. So once again, no such explanation is needed, since conventions, like rules, just are unfalsifiable. So for Wittgenstein, so what you can say about the convention is that it's not useful, that it's not, it's hard to follow, things like that, but you cannot say this is true or false. In this regard, it is like a rule. So for Wittgenstein, what the conventionalists say, that 2 times 2 equals 4 is irrefutably true by convention or due to a convention, is simply nonsense, because 2 times 2 equals 4 is itself a convention or a rule. Hence irrefutable, right? Not truth apt at all. So conventionalism is yet another pointless explanatory ism. We'll have logicism next, because similar things can be said about logicism as well. Although when it comes to logicism, things are slightly more complicated. And I have to confess that I was a bit hesitant to include it here, because Wittgenstein attacks it from a slightly different direction. on one hand. On the other hand, because Frege was not fond of modal notions, so it's very unlikely that he would have formulated a problem in the way we have it here. So we have to stretch things a little bit to include logicism here as well. Now, for a logicist, the proposition 2 times 2 equals 4 is unfalsifiable or necessary because it is ultimately a logical truth. We know the story, we're reducible to a logical truth via definitions, and this is what makes it unlike grass is green, which is contingent, is not so reducible. And such truths, the logical truths, are necessary. End of story. Now, Wittgenstein's take on this is easy to predict at this point, I think. For him, logicism starts off in the wrong direction as well, since logicism 2 aims to explain the irrefutability of 2 times 2 equals 4, while taking it to have this property as a proposition, right? So the right thing to say is that being unfalsifiable is not a property this sentence has as a proposition, but it's a property it acquires when it becomes where it is used as a rule. And at that point, it also loses the property of being truth-apt. So logicism, again, is a pointless enterprise too, is not needed even if it worked. And that's interesting, right? So because as I said, things are complicated here and more has to be said because Wittgenstein on one hand had a lot of admiration and respect for Frege. So he thought that Frege's definition, quote, made an enormous amount clear. And he also thought that on the other hand, that the problems of logicism as a philosophical project are more profound than Russell's paradox. So he didn't think very highly of Russell's paradox. He thought that the problems of logicism are actually deeper. And I gestured at them previously. So, but that's a story for another time. I have a paper on this if you want to look at it. It's actually in a collection that Sorin edited. Okay, so let me wrap things up. I see it's about time. We've discussed what Wittgenstein called an analogy, the parallel grammatical investigation in psychology and mathematics. We saw that it is the grammar of basic mathematical sentence like 2 times 2 equals 4. So we hopefully understood the grammar of this sentence. Namely that it serves 2 functions. It seems to serve 3 functions, but only 2 are actually real ones, a normative and a proposition and a normative one. And for Wittgenstein, those mathematical sentences are true propositions or statements, but they're not super true propositions, so to speak. Where a super true proposition would be a proposition that is true and also has an additional special property that makes it irrefutable. So a special or a super true proposition is necessarily a true proposition, right? On this account, irrefutability comes from normativity, comes directly, as it were. So these sentences, which may also express propositions, become or function as rules or norms or conventions, if you want. So if the traditional problem was to explain what accounts for the irrefutability of a class of propositions, then on Wittgenstein's normativist proposal, that is what is irrefutable are rules, there is nothing to explain. And that appears in PI 126 and made many people, confused many people. How can he say that? Well, I hope we have now a reason to see why he said that. Since rules just are unfalsifiable, right? It turns out that the traditional problem is a pseudo problem and should be discarded. So that's why one major philosophical problem about mathematics completely disappears. Another code. And that's together with the traditional doctrines which propose solutions to it, as if it were a genuine problem. And this concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks so much to Professor Bangu, and I'm sure everyone in attendance joins me in using the applause button. We're very grateful for your talk, and I kindly invite those of you in the audience who'd like to ask some questions to make yourselves known, either by raising your virtual hand, just as I'm doing right now. And I see we already have a first question from Wilhelm Graffe. Friedrich, please go ahead.
I think we'll have to unmute yourself because you appear as muted.
We can hear you now. That's good.
Okay. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I think the analogy between criticism of psychology and mathematical statements has become clear. My question is relates to the internal consistency of Wittgenstein's assessment of mathematical statements, especially arithmetical statements, as rules. Because I have the impression, and your foil, one of your last foil shows it too, I think, there is a relation between Frege's analysis of number and Wittgenstein's talk of arithmetical statements of rule. In a sense, while he disagrees with the Platonistic connotation of this analysis, in a sense, he does make use of, this is my impression, he does make use of Frege's analysis of number. Could you comment on this, please? Thank you.
So there are there are a couple of things here. The first question you raised is, I think it's fundamental for anyone who wants to reconstruct Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics. Is this position, this normativism, is this position consistent? I mean, is it going to work, as it were? And I cannot give you a short answer. I can give you only my hope that it does work, in the sense that it's internally consistent. And I mean, one big question. There are actually two big questions someone might ask here, right? Where are those rules? Where do those rules come from, right? So we're speaking about rules, but then how do we get those? Where do we get them from? Because clearly we don't, according to Wittgenstein, this would sound ridiculous that we have this kind of a mental capacity that Platonists postulate, that we kind of see this abstract reality. You know, there's nothing like that. So we need to give an answer to the question how do we impose those rules? And what makes things even more complicated is that, to my mind, there are two kinds of rules for basic arithmetic, like 2 times 2 equals 4, and rules where the mathematical theorems, which are obviously more advanced. For instance, every continuous function is every differential function is continuous. Things like that. Where do rules like that come from as well? Well, so for the first ones, I think the answer is that the first type of rules, the more primitive ones, they come from empirical regularities, from the way in which we operate with empirical objects around us. For the second types of rules, well, they are kind of derived from the more primitive rules, right? So as this point, it was on the slides some moment, that mathematics is a network of rules. So what the mathematician does is basically try to develop this network of rules. You start with some basic rules, and then you bring in more and more rules on the principle that if certain rules hold, then some other rules can be imposed or can be brought in. So the question is this story is this story going to be consistent? Is the story going to hold? I mean, aren't there going to be like inconsistencies somewhere hidden in this? Again, my hope is that that is true. I mean, the consistency claim is true, that the story is internally consistent. Someone who tells the story has to say more about, obviously more about the notion of proof in Wittgenstein. And yeah, so things are very complicated. What is a proof? Well, again, he says that the proof gives you the, in a way, the license to introduce a rule in the network. So as you can see, things are rather complicated. Now, the second question, I'm not sure I could follow everything you mentioned. So there was this Fregean idea that Frege defines numbers as objects, and this is indeed the Platonist the Platonist instinct that that Frege always had, right? Of course, they're not objects in this like abstract sense; they're logical objects. So Frege's view is a significant improvement on the traditional Platonism. Now, I wasn't sure why or why do you think that Wittgenstein would? Okay, so he says that Frege's analysis of number made an enormous amount clear, and again, it's like a longer story why he said that. He definitely meant it. But it's still slightly unclear to me what you had in mind when you put the two of them together. I mean, what do you think was like the I don't know the point of contact that kind of escapes me at this point?
Okay.
Can you
Short.
elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah. Only short. If we take Frege's analysis of number,
Right,
as stating a property of a concept.
right, yeah.
So this handling concepts may I think, need to be integrated into the conception of arithmetical statements as rules, because in a sense, these are sentences which seem to refer to objects. And if you deny, that's okay. You may deny that there are any Platonist objects, but you cannot deny the syntactical structure, and you have to account in some way for talk of numbers. And Wittgenstein does know, of course, that he has to account for. My question only was if from RFM or LFM there are hints in which direction one could expect an answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so the early Wittgenstein had a somewhat similar project with Frege, right? To in a way define the number, and he said, I think in the Tractatus, that a number is the exponent of an operation, right? So he had like a sort of his parallel project of trying to define number. It's not very prominent. It's not very clear how this is supposed to work in the Tractatus, and I'm not an expert on the Tractatus, I have to say. So that is one aspect where he, in a way, may go parallel to Frege and Russell. When it comes to the later period, he gives up this idea of defining a number. That's not defining what number is. It's not a project he's interested in, partly because he doesn't think it's necessary. So mathematics made enormous progress for thousands of years without such a definition, and that's partly one sort of justification for the idea that maybe such a definition is actually not necessary. But I would resist the so just going trying to pick up on something you said. I would resist the idea that Frege would say more or less the same things as Wittgenstein about those objects. So Frege has a entirely kind of a propositional understanding of mathematics, partly because for him mathematics is ultimately logic. So Wittgenstein goes in like a rather different direction. As you saw, we're dealing with different uses that a linguistic items can have, or speakers can use it. So I don't know. That might sound a bit disappointing, but I'll have to leave it here. I don't. Maybe if you can get together afterwards. If you send me an email explaining a little bit more where you see the point of contact or the point of similarity, I would be glad to address it. But for the moment, I kind of, yeah, I feel like I don't have more to say.
If I may, short reply. Yes, of course, Frege and Wittgenstein go different ways. It's clear. But they have both to account in a systematic way for the talk of numbers, for the arithmetical use of numbers. And this, okay, let me keep it short. This is the point. They have both to account for. They do know that they, and one suggestion, if you think of Lorenzen, constructivist mathematics, he starts creating numbers by counting strokes and abstracting from the concrete strokes and selects the type of this marks or strokes. Anything in any solution which may be very different from Frege's as Lorenzen's is, but some solution has to be given. That is, this was my expectation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll think more about it. It's a very important question. I agree with the premise of your intervention that clearly they both have to account for the numerical vocabulary. It's just as for Frege, in a sense, it's all a matter of propositions and logical derivation. For Wittgenstein, it's slightly different. But yeah, we'll talk maybe more about it later. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Friedrich, for the questions, and Sorin for answering. Next up, we have a question from Mihai. Mihai, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to formulate a worry, which is that your reading of the analogy between mathematical sentences and psychological sentences might not perhaps fully capture the specificity of the analogy. I mean, I think the same analogy in the way you read it can be drawn between mathematical sentences and grammatical propositions in Wittgenstein's sense. If we take an example, a surface cannot be red and green all over at the same time. He regards that as a grammatical proposition. Now, in one sense, we might agree that's assertoric. It says something, although he would say that the truth, if it conveys any truth, is not substantial. It's in a sense empty. So in this way, grammatical propositions would be assertoric like mathematical sentences. They are not referential. Otherwise, grammar would be some kind of structure in an ontological or phenomenological sense, which Wittgenstein doesn't agree with. And they are normative in the sense that they exhibit rules for the use of color words. So the worry is that if we focus only on the free functions of possible language use, we might not capture what is really specific to the analogy between mathematical sentences and psychological sentences, given that we can apply the same analogy to grammatical propositions and perhaps to aesthetic ones. There is this analogy as well in Wittgenstein between mathematics and aesthetics.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, my intuition would be, or I think I would, the way I would read the analogy would be to distinguish between two senses of the notion of psychological sentence, which is in fact ambiguous. On the one hand, it means a sentence about a mental state. I have pain, and that might belong to philosophy, but it might also mean a sentence about a cause, about a mental state. And then the sentence belongs to psychology as a discipline. So Wittgenstein takes issue with this kind of sentences as well, which belong to the discipline psychology. And those criticisms go hand in hand with his criticisms of hypotheses and predictions and experiments as methods borrowed by philosophy and sometimes by thinkers about mathematics. So I guess this is another target of his analogy between mathematics and a criticism of psychology. Various assumptions whether mathematical sentences are experiments in some sense, whether they are predictions, whether they are hypotheses.
I agree. I agree with pretty much everything you said. Now, about the lack of specificity. Well, I mean, what is specific about mathematics is comes from this use of mathematical sentences as rules, right? So, which is not going to be the case for sentences from the psychological vocabulary, right? So, a sentence like 2 times 2 equals 4. Well, if you have 2 bags and 2 objects in every bag, you can use this rule to infer that you have in total 4 objects, right? So in this sense, mathematics is very specific. That is what is like the specificity of this particular type of rule, is that it basically connects right away with reality in the sense that it tells you what you should obtain, right? What is the result of some a way to redescribe the way you should redescribe a certain empirical situation, and that is really not that doesn't hold for psychological sentences. So I think that in a way the specificity would be, you can see what is specific about mathematical sentences at the next step. Once you realize that they are rules for what? Well, they are rules for that control kind of the empirical manipulations. So I think that in a sense, the specificity is already there, is already captured. Now, yes, those grammatical prepositions, they can also be understood in the way you mentioned. He also says at some point that mathematical sentences themselves are grammatical prepositions, right? Simply because they give you, in a way, the rules of the game, right? When it comes to empirical manipulations, while grammatical prepositions have this more general role of giving you the rules of the game when it comes to what can be said meaningfully and what cannot be said. So I think the account sort of contains the seeds of telling you what is specific about mathematics, right? When you look at rules, but what kind of rules? Well, rules which connect with empirical reality. The other one was the stuff about proposition of psychology as causal, and yeah, I mean, I agree. There is a lot in PI about this, and in other places about this distinction. Yeah, maybe you are right. I mean, there is more to say here, in the same way in which you know, the psychological propositions are, in some cases, are not hypotheses. in the same way, mathematical propositions are not hypotheses. Yeah, maybe there is more actually to this analogy. Yeah, okay. I think one can go a little bit farther than that. On the other hand, I was in a way my focus was on the claim that it's we're dealing with an analogous investigation, right? So I wanted to sort of to understand in what way is the same type of investigation we do in both, with regard to both discourses, right? The discourse in psychology and the discourse in mathematics. So the emphasis was not on one type of discourse and then on the other type of discourse, but rather on what is this analogous investigation, right? What makes it to be the same kind of investigation? And it's an investigation about the roles and the regions of language where those sentences appear. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the general point that there is more to say when it comes to the relation between a mathematical sentence and the psychological sentence, along the lines of exactly what you pointed out. There is this sort of ambiguity or duality, if you want, between expressing causes versus rules of language. So yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Thank you. May I have a little follow-up if there's no one else immediately in the queue? Just to get clear, would you say then that mathematics is part of philosophy for Wittgenstein? Because I think there is a sort of, how shall I put it, a sort of variation in the way he relates the two as well. I'm thinking of one point in the Cambridge lectures, the early 30s, where he distinguishes between psychology on the one hand, and he means the discipline as a science, and on the other hand, ethics, comma, aesthetics, comma, philosophy, comma, mathematics, which suggests that at least in that context, he doesn't take mathematics to be part of philosophy. And he doesn't take ethics to be one with aesthetics either, as he did in the lecture on ethics and in the Tractatus.
Yeah. Those
so
are like
in the context of this discussion, I mean, the analogy between mathematics and psychology, then would you say that mathematics is to be understood as a region of philosophy, and psychology understood in the sense of sentences about mental states as another region of philosophy?
I would resist to this idea. So I think that Wittgenstein sees philosophy as sort of a very kind of sui generis, special type of, intellectual preoccupation. Mathematics is what it is, right? So it's a exact science, if you want to call it like that, and psychology is or aims to be a science. Not entirely clear what it is actually, but no, I don't think it regards mathematics as part of philosophy. Philosophy is obviously one. I mean, mathematics can be approached philosophically in the same way in which psychology can be approached philosophically, or chemistry, or whatever. But I wouldn't think that he includes mathematics in philosophy. So for him, those kind of the kind of investigations he goes through are not by any means of a like a, put it like a technical nature, right? So he would never. There are some exceptions in RFM2 where he goes to say infamous things about Cantor, but other than that, he's very careful to keep the two distinct, right? So he's remain in a way humble when it comes to first order mathematical work, and then make some remarks or try to eliminate, try to deal with certain misunderstandings which are of a mathematical or extra mathematical nature, right? So the way mathematicians think about mathematical truth, or the relation between truth and reality, between mathematics and reality. So those are the kind of views that he's interested in, or he thinks he's sort of equipped to deal with, right? So no, the idea that he would regard mathematics as a part of philosophy, I think that, or at least the way he understands philosophy, right? On his understanding of philosophy, they would be rather separate. And the same with psychology. He's interested in those two fields because for him they are actually prone to, so people who work in them and people who think about them, they are prone to make those mistakes and to fall prey to those misunderstandings he's talking about. So that is he can apply his philosophical method to them. So that makes them sort of like a primary objects of investigations, but not because they are also part of philosophy. So, I mean, just to say utter a truism, Wittgenstein is not quite by no means, by any means, right? So, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks so much, Mihai, for the question, Sorin, for answering. Next up, we have a question from Professor Sorin Costreia. Sorin, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, but I think that Vlad was before me, but okay, I'll ask. In fact, I have two questions. First of all, Sorin, thank you for this wonderful conference. I joined the initial Friedrich statement. It's wonderful because it was clear and in a sense problematic in the good sense. I mean, food for thought. So my first question would be, you restricted yourself to comment on arithmetic. What about geometry? Would you say that geometrical sentences share the same nature? And my second question would be, what kind of label would you put on this philosophical whatever doctrine or point of view, or because it wouldn't seem to be full-fledged theory. I mean, Wittgenstein point of view or points of view, right? As you pointed out, that there may be some contradictions or some contradictory points. Namely, would you say that it's a kind of psychologism, I mean, concerning mathematics, or it's closer to fictionalism, or what kind of label would you put on that? Thank you.
Yeah, so the answer to the first question, I think it's rather simple. Yes, the geometry would also fall under the same, more or less under the same, the same type of discussion can be had for geometry. Geometrical propositions are rules on how to deal with spatial figures or spatial configurations or things like that, right? So yeah, if you take, for instance, the Pythagorean theorem, and someone like calculates or measures the sides of a right triangle, then what you tell them, if they come up with a wrong answer, you tell them, no, that's, I mean, for instance, they measure the angles in the triangle or the sides, as I said, we're telling them, no, this is what you should get, not right. So the same sort of prescriptivism or normativism works. So if you're if a high school or like an elementary school student goes to the professor and says, well, ma'am, I just found this this triangle and the sum of the angles is less than 180 or more than 180, the teacher would say, no, it doesn't matter what you measure there, this is what you should get, right? So those are that's the normativity of you must have made a mistake, right? If that's the this is where the normativity gets in. So now the second one is slightly more complicated. I mean, you're asking about a label or well, there are basically there is one element that is kind of common to this type of investigation is this idea of achieving clarity, right, or achieving this kind of position where you can see how the problems you're dealing with are not real problems. So the key word for this, I said, is clarity. It's also therapy, right? So philosophical therapy. Don't try too hard, because there is actually nothing there to solve, right? So there's not a real problem to deal with. So this can have a sort of liberatory effects on someone once you realize that that the issues which seem deep and intractable are in fact artifacts of simply this, like, not having a clear view of what types of statements or what type of linguistic items we're dealing with. So it's therapy, if you want a label. It's also this idea that the role of philosophy is not to build theories, is not in a sense constructive. It's not to build a system of the world or anything like that, but it's rather to untangle knots of thought, right, which appear because we have this tendency to assimilate the roles of sentences and see them like unified. Well, in fact, they're actually very diverse and different. So so in the end, Wittgenstein plays a very different game from compared to the traditional philosophers, people like, I don't know, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and so on. Is more similar in this regard to Nietzsche, more similar, to people who are essentially critics, not or who don't think that there is anything to offer, right? Anything positive to offer, because there is a need for one more theory, right? We don't need one more theory, right? It's just like we have enough theories. What we need is basically to put in order what's in front of our eyes. So that's the kind of game that he's playing, and I don't think he can be judged by the typical standards, like, oh, okay, so he says this. Where is the evidence for it, right? Or what is the there isn't really that much evidence. I mean, it's like going to a doctor. The doctor tells you, well, do this, it might work. And you do it, and sometimes it works. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't, and that's the end of it, right? So now, so he's not making claim. At some point, there's going to be recorded, so I'll have to be careful with that. But at some point, I was thinking maybe I should write a paper why Wittgenstein cannot be wrong. Well, it cannot be wrong because he's not really making any sort of substantial claims about the world or things that can be verified, making like those proposals to look at things in a certain way. Pretty much, yeah. Do this. Think of this in those terms. See this connection, and maybe you'll, if you see this connection, then you will stop thinking in a certain way that bothered you before. So it's this kind of almost like he said at some point that he sees himself as like a disciple of Freud, right? So you can see all those you can see all those connections and relations here. So he also says that philosophy is a work on oneself. It's not really, you're not really solving problems that are like genuine problems out there. You're trying to put yourself in a better position to see why you are actually shouldn't even try in some respects, because there is nothing to, there's no not to unknot, or yeah. So it's very important to see that to see where he is positioned in the history of philosophy. So it's a very peculiar position. Many people don't like it. They like more sort of constructive approaches. But yeah, I think this is also fascinating and very different.
All right, thank you so much to Professor Costea for the question and to Professor Bangu for answering. Next up, we have a question from Vlad Tănăsescu. Before we move on to the question, so again, would you agree that we stop sharing the screen so everyone could see each other better? Would that be all right?
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry about this. I completely forgot.
No, not at all. Not at all. And that said, Vlad, please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. First of all, it was really insightful. Okay, so I actually preferred, by the way, that my question is the last one, or at least at the end, because it's a bit off topic, if I may. Right. So you've mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that well, all philosophical problems in philosophy of mind would be considered pseudo-problems deriving from the misleading question, can I know that you have what I know I have? Right. So, okay, so my question is a bit about the philosophy of mind, if I may. That's why I said it's a bit off topic. Okay, I wanted to actually ask you if you've read this as there can be no answer to this question, as it is a pseudo question, if we were to ask, could philosophical zombies exist or not? Right, or the second case, that this question is not actually a philosophical one, meaning that it doesn't raise any philosophical questions or problems, because you could answer this question quite easily, for example, based on behavioral criteria, as it was interpreted many times. People thought of him like a behaviorist in this matter. This is what I wanted to ask you. Which of these two interpretation would you take? Thank you.
Yeah, I would go for the first one. So not everything that sounds interrogative and has a question mark at the end is actually a question, right? So I have to be very careful with this. So again, the issue here is, and I'll take the just for the sake of the be a bit more kind of specific, the knowledge of other minds, problem of other minds, right? Knowledge of other minds, right? So what we want to know is whether other people have minds, right? So when they say I am in pain, they actually have like this internal states or whatever. But now Wittgenstein's suggestion or strategy here is to look at what kind of, when someone says I am in pain, what kind of statement that is, or what kind of what that person does with that linguistic item, right? So if that item, that linguistic item, that sentence, that string of words does not express a truth-apt content, then there's no issue of trying to find out whether it's can be object of knowledge or not, right? We can only know propositions, right? And if those are not propositions, then there is nothing to know about them. So it's in a sense, it's what happens when we ask about zombies and qualia and all those. we don't realize that those statements, I keep calling them statements, but they're actually, I don't know, like linguistic items, I should call them. I am in pain, right? Strings of words. Those strings of words are used and have those function of expressing actually a certain, I don't know, feeling or a certain way that those persons, those people feel, and they are not expression of knowledge. So it's not that, oh, I know that I'm in pain, right? And this is something I know, and you might also know, or you might fail to know, right? So the idea is that I don't know about myself whether I'm in pain, because I'm in pain is not subject to knowledge, right? It's not a true or false proposition, but it's rather an avowal. So when someone wonders about others, they have this kind of if you want sort of a wrong picture of oh, I know it from my own case, and therefore there might be something about you, right? No, you don't know even about yourself, because there is nothing to know really. So that's not a it's not so the analogy here is not I know that I have $500 in the bank. I wonder if you maybe too, if you have that, if you have the same, right? Psychological language, it simply does not work on the same on the same model, right? So so that is the position that Wittgenstein, I think, would take, and I would follow him here, right? So there is really, it seems as if we're asking a question, but we're actually not asking a question, simply because this kind of linguistic item does not, the purpose and the point of it is not to express a proposition. It's something else, and that's something that cannot be known, and not, it cannot be known not because it's mysterious, it's like deep or anything like that. It's just because as a matter of grammar, you know, you cannot know vowels or interjections or questions. To say that I know a question, well, that's ungrammatical, right? Questions do not have true value. You can know that maybe someone asked a question, or you can know the answer to a question, or but you cannot say I know a question. In the same way, you cannot say I know an vowel. And for this reason, this whole kind of asymmetry, first person perspective, first person, how is that? There is like a whole industry and like a first person. Andrei, I need help here. First person. Someone has a first person
Perspective sounds just right.
Perspective, but also you are in fact privileged as a first person.
Right. Privileged access. That's right.
Yeah, privilege. Well, all those things. There's nothing to have access to actually, right? Because that's not a propositional content, right? Yeah. Now that's one way to look at it through this kind of grammatical lenses. On the other hand, there is an extremely trivial way of looking at this this whole business, right? And I think Wittgenstein also mentioned this in PI. In many cases, there is really, I mean, for all practical purposes, doubting that someone is in pain is just insane. It's not a sign of philosophical sophistication; it's a sign of insanity, right? So that is another way of looking at it. It's either not a question where, in most cases, in cases where it matters, it's just like a trivial, it has a trivial answer, right? And we all know that, you know, people pretend and all those things, but this is just completely irrelevant for the kind of investigation that Wittgenstein proposes here, right? So yeah, we can be fooled. I mean, there are other more sophisticated, more kind of interesting things to think about when it comes to pretense, right? So of course we can be wrong that someone is in pain when they do certain things like cry or you know, like make certain gestures. But even if they want to fool us, right? We know that we know what they want to fool us about, right? So so that is the line that any sort of internal state needs external criteria, right? So it would be absurd for someone to try to convince me that, to fool me that they're in pain by laughing or by you know. So those external criteria also function as some sort of indicators for in public language for how people feel, right? So that's not a mystery at all, right? So yeah, so it's either not a question at all or in most cases a trivial question. I also heard again people saying, oh, but I can doubt that I'm in pain, right? Or I cannot. No, you cannot doubt that you are in pain. What you can doubt is that the word you should use to describe how you feel is pain or tickle or something else. But that has nothing to do with doubting how you feel, because how you feel is basically not something that is a matter of doubt or confirmation, right? So yeah, there is this. I think it's in a sense a jungle. If you go into this, you realize that a lot of the energy and you know, time spent on those issues might be actually I don't know, kind of in vain. They're not going to get anywhere. Sorry, I spoke maybe a little bit more than I should have, but yeah, zombies. Yeah, well, what if I say that I don't believe that there are metaphysical zombies? What are you going to do to me? So yeah, and end of story. So I have a different intuition. Yeah, that's the end of the story. So yeah.
All right, thanks so much, Vlad, for the question, and Sorin for answering. If I may, and only if you have time, Sorin, I'd interject a quick question of my own. This is going to be very simple-minded, very flat-footed, very sort of, you know. So right at the next,
the most dangerous ones, yeah.
Well, I think you'll find it to be fairly accommodating. So right on the next to last slide, I think the wrapping up one, it seemed to me that, and correct me if this is not the gist of the way you were depicting Wittgenstein, it seemed to me that the thought was that 2 + 2 is 4 is true because it's unfalsifiable. It's unfalsifiable because it's irrefutable. It's irrefutable because it's a rule or it's normative or something like that. And my immediate reaction was sort of twofold, but I think both prongs of this were somehow wrong or misleading. So my first reaction was to say, well, what do you mean irrefutable as a rule? Is it as if I'm saying that Einstein is famous as a violinist? It's as it is not famous as a violinist, or is it as if I'm saying that Santa Claus is not a geometrical figure in Euclidean space? Or so what does it mean for a rule to be irrefutable or for it to be refutable, right? Is it something that's simply nonsensical? So that was my initial reaction, right? But then I thought, well, wait a minute, really, is it really the case that rules cannot be refuted? So if I have rules such as don't jaywalk, right? Always cross the street on the pedestrian crossing, never jaywalk, right? That's a nifty rule. And typically people are going to be inclined to say that, look, that rule is going to be as strong as compliance to it is going to be uniform. If you live in a city like New York or whatever, where people jaywalk just as a matter of course, right? That's not really going to be a rule, right? And so far be it from saying that rules are irrefutable, they can be refuted quite often, right? So I guess, but none of those, not the first reading and not the second reading, as simple-minded as they are, seems to capture the thought that the special status of simple arithmetical truths is captured. It's not that they're special because thinking otherwise would be nonsensical, and it's not that they're special because we simply enforced that as a matter of convention in our community or something. Both seem somehow off. And I was wondering exactly how I'm misreading your construal of Wittgenstein.
Well, I think one way to get this straight is that, well, think of this, as I call it, sentence or linguistic item, like a string of words, 2 times 2 is 4. In itself and by itself isn't really anything. So for Wittgenstein, uses fundamental, right? So you have this string of words, those, right? And you can do various things with it. That's the you can state a rule about, and that's as I talked before with Friedrich. So it's a rule about fundamentally about some manipulation of empirical propositions, right? So if I have 2 apples and I have two other apples, then they're together, then I'll have 4 apples, right, in total. So that is a rule that controls how I pass from the first 2 sentences to the third. Okay, so I can use it as a rule, or I can use it as like a statement to tell you what you get, what you should get if you add correctly 2 times 2 and 2, or if you multiply correctly 2. So the key here is to think of that linguistic item as being used as a statement or being used as a rule, right? So in itself is nothing. So when you use it as a rule, then it's obviously irrefutable. And now I'll get to the second part of your question. What you mentioned, like the situation in which people jaywalk and all this, well, what they do, they just don't follow the rule. It's not that they refute the rule. So rules cannot be followed. That's fine. They can be enforced, but not followed, because people don't find it, I don't know, some reason advantageous or cumbersome or things like that. So it's not that by acting, against the rule, we're actually refuting the rule. No, we're not refuting the rule. We're simply not following the rule. Now, the complication here, which I didn't get into, is this naturalistic strand in Wittgenstein, because for him, rules are actually extracted, are somehow, he calls them like petrified empirical regularities. So you have a rule because people do certain things and nature is in a certain way regularly like that. And if those regularities somehow would disappear, right, somehow the world would not be like this, people would not behave like that, then the rule would kind of lose interest, kind of would not have the rule would not be in place anymore, right? So it's not that we refuted the rule, it's simply that we simply remove the rule from the books, right? So now there is no way to convince you that a rule, I mean, to refute a rule is basically to find a fact that, or to find a way in which you can say, well, this statement is false. But I mean, think of the rules more like by analogy with questions, or with, can you refute a question? Well, again, you can do many things with a question, but not refute it, or it's simply not the kind of thing which is falsifiable. It doesn't, a rule does not state anything, right? In some cases, it might seem that it states that a football team should have 11 players, but it's not really a statement. It's more like, if you have 11 players, you're gonna play football. If you don't have enough 11 players, you might have a game, but you're not gonna play football, right? You're gonna play something else. So rules, by their nature, cannot be refuted, and Wittgenstein capitalizes on this, right? Because this is what is specific for mathematics, or so we take it, that we cannot refute mathematical, again, statements, I'm going to call them like this, by invoking empirical findings. So if someone has two again, 2 apples, another 2 apples, and then they say there, oh, but I have 5 apples. Well, you don't. Just count again, right? So that is in a way the difference between him and Quine. Someone like Quine would say, no, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a statement, and once you find 5 apples, and that finding is sort of like stable, many people found it and all this, then 2 plus 2 equals 4 being a statement counts as being refuted, right? So you simply have to refute this is his holism, right? For Wittgenstein, no, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is outside of this game of refutation and confirmation. You don't confirm that 2 plus 2 equals 4 either, right? Quine would say, no, we do confirm it. Everything is empirical findings will confirm both empirical propositions and non-empirical propositions, right? So for Wittgenstein, the idea is that those arithmetical statements, this one in particular, they are somehow outside of the realm of refutation, because they are rules of the game and not like moves in the game, if you want, right?
Could I interject just a very quick follow-up?
Yeah, please.
So thanks so much for that. I'm just thinking about this idea that rules cannot be refuted, and naturally there won't be any empirical fact at issue or anything like that. However much we tried, we won't be able to succeed in pulling off a stint like that. But I'm thinking of something along the lines of, maybe this is going to be a very broad reading of Wittgenstein, right? So I'm thinking of what would make such a rule enjoy the normative force it does, right? So somebody might say, look, rules maybe cannot be refuted by facts, rules cannot be broken in this sense, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be flouted. That
It cannot be
flouted. They cannot be, we might simply be insensitive to the normative force of such rules.
Sure.
We might not feel their normative bite, as it were. And in a sense, we might be, a rough analogy would be somebody who's entirely impervious to traffic rules. And when they jaywalk, it's not that that's a fact counting as breaking the rule or as, in some sense, going against the rule. The person in question just simply doesn't care whether that's a rule or not, right? They're flouting the rule. They don't recognize its normative force, as it were. And so I wonder, would that kind of stance be any problem here?
You can see this playing a role, for instance, in like a history of mathematics, when people invented alternative geometries, right? So yeah, sure, there is this rule that the axioms, by the way, are rules, right? It's much easier to accept that axioms are rules rather than the theorems are rules, but they're also rules. I mean, everything is, mathematics is a network of rules. That's the quote from Wittgenstein. So yeah, so those people, I mean, obviously not like your absent-minded jaywalker. They like actively sort of set aside one axiom from the system and try to develop a different. So you simply don't care about one rule of the system, and then you try to develop a system which does not contain that rule, right? So that would be, now this is not really related to Wittgenstein, because the Wittgenstein business has to do with whether or not someone follows the rule, whether someone follows the rule or not, right? So, and what they do can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. And so we have this story in Wittgenstein that fundamental here is basically brute training, in which people simply do one way and they don't look at all sorts of like distractions that might seem as if they follow, might look as following the rule, but it's actually not, right? So put that aside. What you have in, I think what you have in mind is this kind of situation when yeah, someone decides or is just like impervious to the force of one rule and simply sets it aside, right? And yeah, that's entirely possible. It's not, that doesn't mean that that rule was was refuted. It's just that was kind of bracketed for all sorts of purposes, and it's not was not considered to be part of the part of what governs our behavior or our mathematics or whatever. So yeah, people can introduce and eliminate rules all the time. That's the game that we play. People introduce rules about negative numbers. There used to be a time when the answer to, I mean, there's no answer to the question, can we add something to 2 and get 1? Well, yeah, there was a time in the history of humankind when this question had no answer. Now we know it has the answer -1, right? So we have negative number. The same with square root of -1 and things like that, right? So introduce rules, eliminate rules depending on our needs, after all, right? So that's the idea. And but that doesn't mean that the rules we eliminate are actually refuted. No, we're just, for some reason, we're not interested in them anymore. So what someone should say about them is that they stopped serving certain roles and that's absolutely okay to say about the rule. Well, this rule is not doing what it's supposed to do, is not serving us. Maybe it's very hard to follow, and that's the reason why we want to set it aside. But that doesn't mean that we refuted it. No, it's just that we set it aside, and that's like a completely different sort of type of situation when you set aside a rule as opposed to you cannot refute it anyway, but as opposed to trying to refute it, right?
So that sounds,
yeah.
That sounds entirely natural and true and important. And I think you're entirely right in this. I was just wondering if the gist of your interpretation was to say that 2 + 2 is 4 is unfalsifiable because it's a rule, or
it's unfalsifiable when it is used as a rule.
Oh, I see.
So this idea of using a certain, again, linguistic item in this case as a rule, then when you use it as a rule, then it becomes unfalsifiable, right? So
that leaves it open whether it has other uses as well.
Yeah, you can use it as a true proposition, right? To tell someone what's the right result of because you can inform someone about a certain result and you can be wrong, right? If you are in a elementary arithmetic classroom with like pupils and all this, so one student informs you that 2 × 55 × 37 is whatever. They simply inform you that that's they mean to use that as like a true sentence. They want it to be a true sentence. You do the calculation, you say, no, that's wrong, that's false, and that's fine. So there are contexts when you can actually use certain linguistic items, the mathematical ones, as a statement, as propositions, and that's a very natural use. Again, Wittgenstein talks about mathematical truth all the time, everywhere. So to say that they're not true, I mean, there is something like true about the fact that fundamentally they are not truths because they are rules, right? But you cannot say it like that because sometimes they are used as propositions. Although when you wonder how is that, what's the mystery? How is that sentence, proposition, whatever, unfalsifiable? Well, simply because what you are trying to do is trying to falsify a rule, and you will never be able to do it. So that's you'll never be able to do it because rules are just not the kind of thing that not the kind of linguistic item that is falsifiable. So that is the trick, right? So think of them when you try to figure out why are they unfalsifiable. Think of them. Okay, so what am I trying to falsify here? Well, I'm trying to falsify a rule, but of course I'm not going to be able to do it. So it's unfalsifiable, right? Again, the superficial grammar is that of a indicative sentence, but that doesn't mean that they always function as indicative sentences. For instance, when they control manipulations of quantities in empirical domain, right? So in that, and that's like the typical use of such a sentence. And that's why we actually invented mathematics, because you have those empirical sentences. There are 2 apples on the table. Someone puts another 3 apples on the table, and you want to know beforehand how many apples are on the table, right? Without counting them all the time. That functions like a very important kind of a time-saving instrument. Or someone has cattle or armies or things like that. So you know beforehand how many are there. Of course, if nothing kind of empirically weird happens. I mean, if someone puts one drop of water and then another drop of water, then we're not gonna have 2 drops of water. We're gonna have only 1. But that's not really. I mean, that's more of an exception. You can look at it in a different way. Maybe the mass of the water, like 1 gram of water, then another gram of water. Things are tricky, but generally speaking, using those rules to deal with empirical contexts, it's very, very useful. And yeah, that's why we have it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. I mean, yeah, it's hard. Some people hate it. So.
All right, thank you so much for the generous answer. And I wonder if there's any final question for Professor Bangu. And if not, please join me once again in thanking him for a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing. Yeah.
All right. And thanks to each and every one of you for being here. Thanks especially to Sorin Bangu for the talk, and have a wonderful week. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Glad to see you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. You too.